So like Sagata, my background was not in education originally. I had a doctorate in computer science and worked on artificial intelligence and various things. Then got into education and then most recently in information science. I want to talk about future of learning. Sagata gave us a very interesting and inspiring one vision of what the future might be. I'm going to present three more, and I imagine that some of you have other visions, and if we have time in discussion, I hope that you'll share yours as well. So I'm going to these are three commonly talked about visions of the future. Actually, the first two there's a lot written. The third one maybe a little less so. The first one's utopia, a sort of wonderful vision of how everything's going to be great in education if we just use the right tools. The second one is a dystopia, where it's going to be wrong no matter what we do. And the third one I call an impossibility, because I'm not sure that we have the cognitive means to figure out how to bring that about, but I'll spend the most time on that one. I'm going to quickly run through the first two because I think some of this will be familiar to many of you. This is an engraving by Francis Bale of New Harmony, Indiana, which was an early utopian community in the United States, I think around 1825. It was noteworthy because it was the first coeducational public school in the United States and also the first vocational school. And I think Owen's son started the Smithsonian Institution. They brought in teachers, Pestalozzi-trained teachers from Europe. And it was quite an adventure. It only lasted 2 years, but it was an important milestone. Today, though, I think when many people talk about a future of education, they have a picture somewhat like this in mind, that we have today classrooms that are dominated by lectures and textbooks, and I think the kind of thing Sagata was asking us to get away from, and moving more to activity-based learning where teachers are working with students on projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all the details here, but just to hit some of the buzzwords. One big thing is this idea of flipped classrooms, going from that lecture and text version to a flipped classroom. So for example, I'm teaching an online course at the University of Illinois, which means I would have to be up at midnight to teach the class when I wouldn't be much good. So I'm going to ask my students to view the videos of the talks this week and then interact with them around their projects separately. So rather than feeling like I need to be there to lecture or present. Along with this is an idea of getting away from knowledge delivery, moving towards projects and activities, going from fixed classrooms to learning anywhere, anytime, more personalized education, going to interpretation away from just simple calculations, and so on. And assessment changing, people talking about micro-credentialing and getting credit for work experience and that kind of thing. One of the attractions of this way of thinking is many people see it as very aligned with work, with fast-paced changes in the work world, making learning more like the activities of work. And that has both positive and negative sides to it. There's also dystopian discourse about what's wrong with education and how it's not only bad, but it's getting worse all the time. This is Louis Le Brocquet's painting of a family, which you can see at the National Gallery here, painted shortly after World War II, and it was with, in the background was concern about nuclear war and poverty and many other problems which we still face today, of course. This dystopian view gets a lot of backing from looking at young people who are often feel alienated, think of school or as a waste of time, engage in antisocial behavior. It's a very popular book in the US, which I think has now gone internationally, is called the Teenage Liberation Handbook. how to quit school and get a real life in education. Along with youth being left out or unsatisfied with their education, we have communities that are struggling with divides across religion, politics, language, and so on. Danielle Allen has a wonderful book called Talking to Strangers, where she says, there's one thing that every parent all over the world says to their 4-year-old, and that's don't talk to strangers. But if we don't learn to talk to strangers, we can't address any of the problems that we're confronting in the world today, whether it's climate or poverty or health issues or whatever. If you want to get really depressed, I recommend David Blacker's book. He would acknowledge all the things I've just said about what's going wrong with our societies. But he goes further and says that neoliberal capitalism is moving into a new phase. It's gone beyond just exploiting labor. Theft by finance is rising. We're being targeted along with our environment as waste products awaiting managed disposal. Education is caught in this eliminationism, crushing student debt and so on, the looting of public institutions. And he concludes by saying, for educational institutions, there is no escape. As I said, it can cheer you up if you're feeling too happy. One thing I like to point out, there's an interesting, I always like to look at things that seem like they're going off in totally different directions that actually often have some interesting similarities. And both of these accounts that I've just shared with you, the utopian and the dystopian, are interestingly aligned with capitalism as we know it today and with how our societies are organized. I think Rose's question after the last talk gets at this kind of issue, that it's very hard to think about education separately from the society that it exists within. So I want to switch to a third view, and I'm going to spend most of my time on this one. I call this impossibilia, because I'm not sure whether it's achievable in the way that we currently think about education. We may have to think in entirely new ways, and that's not an easy thing to do. This is, by the way, I think it's Eric Johansson, who has some wonderful photographs of impossible images, which I really like. So there's our house on the hill, which is just the back of a fish. To get into this impossibility view, I want to talk about how, when we talk about educating people, we often talk about that because if we educate young people and turn out a good product, those products can then go out and help us to build a better world. They get good jobs, they help build democracy, they help alleviate social problems, and so on. But there's an equally important direction of that arrow, which is to realize that building a better world may be necessary to build a better education system. That our education system is always going to be limited by the world that it sits within. So we sometimes talk as if only we had better education, we wouldn't have all this unemployment. If only we had better education, we'd have more functioning democracy, for example, in the United States. If only education were better, we could address problems of health and social welfare and drugs and all the other issues. But sometimes that may be asking an awful lot. In fact, I think it's always asking a lot of education to fix the problems of the world. We might equally well say, could we work on the problems of the world in order to help fix education? And of course, these are what you might call mutually constituted. Richard Lewontin, who, by the way, Rose, you mentioned in your talk that about research showing that between race differences were swamped by within race. I mean, I got that right, but basically that there's no such thing as human races in a biological sense. Richard Lewontin, I think, did the seminal article on that idea. But he says we can't think of we can't think of an organism without an environment. Similarly, we can't think of an environment without organisms. The organisms help create and change environments. The environment helps create and change the individual. There's a Greek word used much in early classic literature. Plato, Aristotle, the Sophists, others talked about eudaimonia. Eudaimonia literally means something like good demons, having a good demon inside you or good spirit. But more commonly, it's translated today as human flourishing. And there's a view of education we could think of as to say that what it's about is not acquiring knowledge, acquiring skills, learning techniques of this kind or that, but it's ultimately about helping humans flourish. And this photograph, I think, gets for me at the idea of what we're talking about here, is that if you want a plant to grow, more important than which plant you pick or how much you tend it, is that you need a rich soil in which that plant can grow. Without the soil, very few plants can survive. And the same is true for people. I live on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and parts of Cape Cod have been denuded of their forests. When the Europeans came, they chopped down all the trees, then discovered that underneath there was just sand and they couldn't grow anything. So then they moved west, leaving behind a terrain that had lost most of its trees. The forests are coming back, but much of Cape Cod looks like this. Here's a beach scene with white sand. It's very pretty in its own way. But as you can see, very few plants can survive on a windswept dune. As these plants grow and die, eventually the soil can recover. In order to achieve eudaimonia, in order to build an education system that promotes eudaimonia, we need something that goes beyond just simply a vision of helping students learn faster and better. We need what Hans Despeng calls a depth pedagogy, which focuses on things like civic engagement, personal development, self-awareness and awareness of others, and cosmic wonder and awareness. So why is it impossible? I mean, I think views like this resonate with most people, and we say, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I would want for my children. That's what I want for myself. So why is it so hard? Well, I could give you a long list of reasons. I'm going to go through just a few of them. One is that I think we don't generally recognize how important a thriving society is for individual development, individual growth. Without that kind of awareness, it's very hard to create schools that promote eudaimonia. Along with this is an idea of seeing the gains of others as beneficial for all, so that it's not about competition and how do I get ahead. It's not a race to the top, as we would say in the US. It's about how can we help everyone develop together. It also means getting beyond instrumentalism. Much of the discourse about education is, what technique shall I use to engender the learning of the knowledge and skills? And those skills will then transfer to the workplace or to the next grade. So students go to kindergarten to prepare themselves for grade 1, and they go to grade 1 to prepare for grade 2, and so on. We're in this pipeline. And it's a way of thinking that's a lot more powerful than we often realize. It also means to think of education not just as a means to helping us get better, but education as an end in itself. John Dewey says the only valid end of education is education, that human growth is itself a value and something we ought to recognize. And a final point, I mean, not the final point, but a fifth one, let's say, is to not think of what we do in education as judging in the sense of, did you get it right or not, but as bringing ideas to life and bringing the individual to life. I want to quote the famous Leo Casey here talks about pathways to participation. One of the ways that we can help bring about a eudaimonia in education is to think about how do we get more fuller participation. I want to go through just a very simple example, and I'm not presenting this as the way to do things, but just simply one educator's attempt to create more participation. This was a project working with young people from Michoacan, which is a state in Mexico. It suffered greatly under NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. It's an agricultural community. Basically, their business disappeared. And many of the people from Michoacan came to the United States. Many came to Illinois, where I was teaching. And we had 10 and 12-year-olds showing up who'd had very little schooling, who couldn't speak English, whose parents were illiterate, who had many challenges they were facing in school. And this is a project I was, I guess, advising on, but it was my graduate student, Ching Chu Lin, who really did it. Students created podcasts to tell their own story. And the idea was tell the story of their life in Mexico and now their life in the United States and deal with all the conflicted feelings they had about this. This boy says he likes the teams, football teams, the Blue Cross and the Hidalgo team. And so this was his story was about football. This is Ching Chu meeting with students in a middle school and talking with them about critical literacy, art. We used artworks. This is the one by, does anyone know who this artist is? Yeah. She painted quite a few pictures about her own conflicts coming from Mexico to the United States. This is titled something like A Border View of Mexico and the US. And if you look, we could spend the rest of the session just looking at this painting because there's so much in it, but she has the white roots of the beautiful flowers in Mexico and the black cords coming out of the technology in the US. You can tell she's looking towards Mexico. That's the bigger part of the picture. There's a bright moon and sun, and the US is clouded with pollution and factories. And obviously she was not totally happy with the move to the US. But she used art as a way to talk about it and to express her feelings. Ching Chu created a podcast of her own story coming from Taiwan to the United States and about what things she missed in Taiwan and what things she enjoyed in the US or didn't enjoy. And also what things were the same. For example, she liked to ride bicycles and rode bicycles both places. And students worked together. They used the internet, but they also used snapshots from home. They talked to their parents and their grandparents, and they got stories. They interviewed family members. They looked at artifacts, so jewelry, clothing, other things from home. They basically did research into their own families. We used the inquiry cycle as a way to talk about this, and you can sort of look at every aspect of this cycle. They investigated through multiple media. They created. They wrote songs. They wrote stories. They practiced narration. They used dance. They used created their own artwork. They did graphic design, many different arts, and many different ways of telling their story. And they discussed this with their peers. They worked together. They also discussed it with family. This is part of what we called community as the curriculum, learning in a connected way, learning to act responsibly in the community, and learning how to transform the community. This is an excerpt from Elizabeth's podcast. You can tell she's learning English. She's explaining she's from Michoacan. And now let's see if we can get the podcast itself to work.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Rodriguez, and this is my pride. My culture. I was born in Michoacan, Mexico. I love Mexican food and everything. I would love to go back to my country one day. Latin people love to party a lot. I'm 100% Latina. Me and my friends. I love to hang out with them a lot and go to the movies. The coolest thing is that we all love posters. My family. I have a big family. I have a sister and 3 brothers, which I don't usually hang out with them a lot. Things I love. I love to listen to music, being in my room alone, posters, and I especially love my flashes. My favorite sports. My favorite sports are soccer, basketball, and swimming. And
So the reason I wanted to share Elizabeth's was that some of what she did was sort of formulaic. She was looking at what the other kids were doing, you know, my favorite sports, my favorite clothes, my favorite this and that. But there was something else going on. She was slow to get started. And I went up to her and I said, she was just sitting there. The other kids were typing away and pulling stuff off the internet and using scanners and all this stuff. And I said, Elizabeth, what's wrong? And she said, well, I left Michoacan when I was very young, and we moved again, and I don't really remember much about it, so I can't say much about it. And I said, sort of stupidly, well, that's okay. You could just talk about your life in the US. And I walked away, and she sat there thinking for a minute, and then all of a sudden she got into this flurry of activity. She changed the title from My Story to My Pride. And she basically wanted to say, well, I can't answer all your questions. I can't really tell you the details of what it's like was like in Michoacan. But I want you to know that I love Mexico. I am 100% Latina. And I think she says, I love Mexican food and everything. And she wanted to really, express that this was who she was, and that it may not fit into some formula, but it was a way of communicating who she was and how she relates to the world. This is Ching Chu, who was a graduate student involved with this. I mentioned her earlier. And she wrote a paper about how much she learned doing this as teacher. So she's a teacher, but she didn't really know much about Hispanic culture, particularly about Mexico. She'd come from Taiwan. She learned a lot about what it meant to be an immigrant in a new country, but also about her own self-exploration as she tried to tell her story to these children who were, who didn't know much about Taiwan. She had to explore her own identity. And again, all of them using many forms of communication. The students, the young people, went on and they shared the podcast with their families and friends. This brought their parents more into the school, more connected. They ended up recruiting their friends to join a program we had called Digital Click. It was a summer camp program. And they became the leaders of the camp. Projects like this, there's a lot more to say about them, but I think what they show, it gives us some glimpses of how young people's life in school can be made more connected to their community. This is a picture actually not from Mexico. This is from Turkey, one of the community schools. All over the world, community schools are being closed in favor of big regional schools. And I think we may be losing something there that we ought to reflect upon. A community school like this involves the parents, including the fathers, in the life of the school, and has learning that's connected to the meaningful things in the village. I have to quote one of my favorite writers, Jane Addams, who said, writing in 1902, so 115 years ago, she says, "We've learned to say that the good must be extended to all of society, before it can be held securely by any one person or class. Now, I might want to argue with Jane, even though she's my hero, and say, I'm not sure we've all learned that. I think we're still a far away from this. This gets, I think, at Leo's point about participation, but Jane Addams took it one step further. She says, but unless all men in all classes contribute to a good, we can't even be sure that it's worth having. So, for example, on Cape Cod, I have a friend who buys tickets to the symphony for young people who couldn't afford to go otherwise, which I think is terrific. But that's sort of the first part she's talking about, bringing people in to participate in the goods of society. But what Jane Addams says is we also need to go the next step. We need to say, what about their music? And why don't we learn, whatever their songs from Mexico, or their songs, their rap or hip hop, or whatever it might be. Okay, I'm going to try to do one last little bit here. There's a saying on the internet about the 3 R's, rate, rank, and recommend. That seems to be a lot of what the internet's about. And in education, a lot of what we do is focused on testing, measuring, grading, grades in the classroom, districts' grades, national tests, and so on. And I have a little bit of an extended quote. This is from Michel Foucault, and it's very unusual if you know his writing. It's not what he normally does. He says, Courbet, this is a Courbet painting, he said, Courbet had a friend who used to wake up at night yelling, I want to judge, I want to judge. It's amazing how people like judging. Judgment's being passed everywhere all the time. Foucault, now talking about criticism, but I think I would apply this to teaching, he says, I can't help but dream about a kind of criticism that wouldn't try to judge, but would bring an oeuvre, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. It would light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it. It would multiply not judgments, but signs of existence. It would summon them, drag them from their sleep. Perhaps it would even invent them, all the better, all the better. Criticisms that hands down sentences sends me to sleep. I'd like a criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. It wouldn't be a sovereigner dressed in red. It would bear the lightning of possible storms. And one last example. This is William James, famous psychologist. The William James Hall is the psychology building at Harvard. James has a wonderful story in an essay called What is Pragmatism? And again, I think about this in terms of teaching. He says, Jack's in love with Jill, but none of us can figure out why. What does he see in her? They're not right for each other. Love is blind, right? You've heard that. So James goes on, and it doesn't stop there, and he says, so what does Jack see in Jill? Well, he sees the parts of Jill that are beneath the surface. He sees the parts of Jill that the rest of us don't see. He sees Jill not only as she is today, but as she would like to be, as she hopes to be. He sees Jill in terms of the kind of person that she's striving to be. And beyond that, he sees in Jill that she sees the same thing in him. That Jill can look at Jack and see the parts of him that are hidden from the world. So James asks, if Jack and Jill can see so much in each other that we cannot see, why do we say that they are blind and not us? This kind of teaching that I'm talking about is not easy, and it's not easy on the individual level to be sensitive in the way that James was talking about, but it's even harder when we talk about getting a society that believes education is an end for people. That's a bigger change to make. Confucius talked about this, as he talked about many things. In the Analects, there's a little story. Shukang comes to the gatekeeper and says, where do you come from? He says, from Confucius. And the gatekeeper says, oh yes, the one who knows how impossible things are and yet keeps trying. And last slide here, last two slides. Stephen Toulmin, modern contemporary philosopher, has a book called Return to Reason. And I think he gets it, summarizes in one way what I've been talking about. The future belongs not so much to pure thinkers who are content with optimistic or pessimistic slogans. It's a province rather for reflective practitioners. The ideals of practical thinkers are more realistic than the optimistic daydreams of simple-minded calculators who ignore the complexity of real life, or the pessimistic nightmares of the critics who find in these complexities a source of despair. So with that, I will conclude. So thank you.